After my son's funeral, his boss called me. You need to know the truth about him. Daniel Whitfield had buried his wife 11 years ago, and he had promised himself, standing over that grave in the rain, that he would never again know a grief that deep. He was wrong. He knew that now, standing in the same cemetery, in the same black suit that had grown a little looser around the shoulders since the last time he'd worn it, watching a different casket disappear into the same cold Ohio ground. This one held his son. Ethan, 28 years old, gone in a single-car accident on a rain-slicked highway outside Columbus, 3 weeks before his birthday, 2 days after he'd called Daniel to say he might be coming home for a visit, that there was something he wanted to talk about in person. Daniel never got to hear what it was. The funeral was small. Ethan hadn't been an especially social person, quiet, private, the kind of son who called his father every Sunday at exactly 6 p.m., but rarely volunteered much about his life beyond the surface. He'd worked in Columbus for the last 4 years at a mid-sized logistics company called Halbrook Freight Solutions, doing something in operations that Daniel had never fully understood, and he was ashamed to admit now, had never asked enough questions about. 23 people came to the service. Daniel shook every hand, absorbed every murmured condolence, and felt none of it touch the enormous, echoing hollow that had opened up in his chest 3 weeks ago and showed no signs of closing. He was folding the last of the folding chairs in the small chapel hall, alone, the caterers long gone, when his phone rang. An unknown number, Columbus area code. He almost didn't answer. Grief had made him allergic to phone calls. Every one of them for 3 weeks had been someone wanting something from him. Insurance forms, funeral home logistics, well-meaning relatives who didn't know what to say and said too much anyway, but something made him pick it up. Mr. Whitfield, the voice was a woman's, careful, a little unsteady. My name is Rosalind Cortez. I was Ethan's supervisor at Halbrook. I'm so sorry for your loss. I know this is a difficult time to be calling. Daniel closed his eyes. Thank you, that's kind of you. I don't want to intrude, Rosalind continued, and there was something in her tone, a carefulness that felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced this call several times before dialing, but I think there are some things you deserve to know about your son. Things that didn't come up at the service. Would it be possible for you to come to Columbus? I'd rather not do this over the phone. Daniel's stomach tightened. In the 3 weeks since the accident, he had learned to brace himself against sentences that began this way. Is there a problem? Something with his work, or... No, Rosalind said quickly. No, nothing like that. It's not bad news, Mr. Whitfield, I promise you that. But it's not something I can explain properly in a phone call. Please, I think you need to see this in person. He agreed to come the following Tuesday. The drive from his home in Marietta to Columbus took just under 2 hours, and Daniel spent most of it turning the phone call over in his mind like a stone he couldn't stop rubbing between his fingers. You need to know the truth about him. Not I'm sorry, or he was a good employee, or any of the 100 soft, forgettable things people said about the dead. The truth, as if there had been something false about the son Daniel thought he knew. He tried to think of what it could be. Debt maybe, some financial trouble Ethan hadn't wanted to worry him with, or a relationship. Ethan had always been cagey about his personal life, and Daniel had sometimes wondered without ever asking whether there was someone he was keeping private for reasons of his own. Whatever it was, Daniel told himself, he would receive it with grace. Whatever his son had been hiding, it didn't change the 28 years Daniel had spent loving him. Halbrook Freight Solutions occupied a squat brick building on the industrial edge of the city, flanked by loading docks and a gravel lot half full of company trucks. Daniel parked, sat for a moment gathering himself, and went in. Rosalind Cortez met him in the lobby. She was maybe 45, dressed simply, with the tired, competent bearing of someone who managed dozens of employees and thousands of shipments a week without much fuss. Her handshake was firm, her eyes kind but red-rimmed, like she hadn't slept well either. Thank you for coming, she said. I know this wasn't easy. You said it wasn't bad news, Daniel said, unable to help himself. I've been trying to guess for 4 days. A small, sad smile crossed her face. I promise it isn't, come with me. She led him not to an office but down a back hallway, through a set of double doors, into what looked like an underused break room that had been converted into some kind of storage space. Along one wall stood a row of grey filing cabinets. On a folding table sat several cardboard boxes, and beside them, a laptop. This is going to take some explaining, Rosalind said, gesturing for him to sit. So let me start from the beginning. She sat across from him, folded her hands, and began. Ethan started here 4 years ago as a logistics coordinator. Entry-level position, nothing special on paper. But within about 6 months I noticed something. He was staying late, not because anyone made him, but because he'd found this pattern in our shipping data. Certain routes, certain drivers, certain warehouses where the numbers didn't quite add up. Small stuff at first. A pallet here, a manifest discrepancy there. Nothing that would set off alarm bells on its own. Daniel frowned. I don't understand. Are you telling me someone was stealing from the company? I'm telling you your son figured out that someone was, Rosalind said. And it wasn't small-time pilfering. It was a fraud operation running through 3 of our regional hubs, falsified shipment records, ghost inventory, kickbacks between a couple of our warehouse managers and an outside trucking contractor. Over about 6 years before Ethan ever got here, it added up to just over $4 million in losses that the company had been quietly absorbing and writing off as shrinkage. Nobody upstairs wanted to look too closely at it, because looking too closely meant admitting how long it had been happening under their noses. Daniel sat very still. This was not what he had braced himself for. Ethan found this. Ethan found this, Rosalind confirmed, on his own time, with a spreadsheet he built from data nobody had asked him to pull. He came to me with it about 3 years ago, very quietly, very carefully, because he wasn't sure yet who else might be involved. We spent the better part of a year building a case, cross-referencing shipment logs, GPS data from the trucks, financial records. He was meticulous, almost obsessive about it, honestly. I used to tell him to go home, that it could wait until tomorrow, and he'd just say, someone's been getting away with this for years. One more night doesn't matter to them, but it might to us. She reached over and opened one of the cardboard boxes, pulling out a thick manila folder, worn soft at the edges from handling. She slid it across the table to Daniel. This is the file he put together. It's the reason 2 of our regional managers were fired last spring, and it's the reason there's an ongoing investigation right now, federal actually, because it crossed state lines into the trucking contractor involved. Ethan testified in a deposition 6 weeks ago. He was scheduled to testify again in front of a grand jury in about 3 more weeks. Daniel opened the folder with hands that weren't quite steady. Inside were pages of spreadsheets, printouts of emails, a timeline in Ethan's small, careful handwriting, the same handwriting Daniel remembered from birthday cards and Christmas lists, now devoted to columns of numbers and dates and names Daniel didn't recognize. Why didn't he tell me any of this? Daniel asked, and his voice cracked on the last word. Rosalind's expression softened. I asked him that once, not long after the deposition actually. I told him he ought to have some kind of support system who knew what was going on, in case things got complicated. Legally, I mean, or otherwise, and he said, she paused, as if deciding whether to continue. He said his dad had already been through enough. That you'd lost his mom, and that you worried about him constantly even when there was nothing to worry about, and he didn't want to hand you something else to lie awake over. He said, if it goes well, I'll tell him the whole story when it's finished and it'll just be good news. If it goes badly, there's no point in him carrying the fear the whole time too. Daniel had to look away for a moment. Through the small window in the break room, he could see a forklift moving pallets in the yard outside, ordinary and indifferent to the conversation happening inside. He was protecting me, Daniel said quietly. He was, Rosalind said. That was Ethan. I want to be honest with you, Mr. Whitfield. In 20 years of managing people, I have never worked with anyone like him. He wasn't just smart, he was principled in a way that's rare. He could have looked the other way. Plenty of people did for years. It would have been so much easier for him to just do his job, collect his paycheck, and not go looking for trouble that wasn't his to find, but he couldn't let it go. He told me once that his mother used to say that the people who don't get caught aren't the ones who never get noticed. They're the ones nobody bothers to notice. He didn't want to be the kind of person who didn't bother. Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, embarrassed, and Rosalind pushed a box of tissues across the table without comment. There's more, she said gently, after a moment. I want you to see the rest when you're ready. She reached into the second box and pulled out a smaller folder, this one newer, the paper crisper. About 8 months ago, the company set up a formal whistleblower award program, once legal counsel understood the scale of what Ethan had uncovered. It's tied to the Federal False Claims Act recovery. When the case resolves, whistleblowers who report fraud against government contracts, which this touched because some of the falsified freight involved federally subsidized shipping routes, are entitled to a percentage of whatever's recovered. Daniel blinked. I don't. What are you telling me? I'm telling you that Ethan was in line for a settlement, Rosalind said. A significant one. The case hadn't resolved yet. These things take years, and now with him gone, it'll take even longer and go through his estate instead. But our legal team estimates the recovery, once everything is finalized, will be somewhere between $8 and $11 million. Ethan's share per the agreement he signed would have been between 15 and 20% of that. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Daniel had spent 3 weeks thinking of his son's life in Columbus as small, an apartment, a job he didn't talk much about, a modest, quiet existence that Daniel had sometimes worried was lonelier than Ethan let on. He had never imagined this. Not the fraud, not the danger his son might have quietly courted by pursuing it, and certainly not the number Rosalind had just said out loud in a converted break room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee. "I don't want that money," Daniel said, more sharply than he meant to. That's not why I'm here. I didn't come here for." "I know," Rosalind said, and her voice held no judgment at all. "I know that's not why you're here, but it's part of the truth, and I promised you the truth. And there's something else you should know, which I think matters more than the number." She pulled one more sheet from the folder, a single page, handwritten, unmistakably in Ethan's script. "About 4 months ago, Ethan came to me and asked what would happen to the settlement money if something happened to him before the case resolved. I remember thinking it was a strange, morbid question, and I asked him why he was even thinking about it. He said his job had gotten more dangerous than he expected. Some of the people implicated weren't just going to lose their positions quietly, and he'd started being careful about which route he drove home and not telling people his schedule in advance. He wasn't dramatic about it. He just wanted to be prepared, so legal helped him draft this." She handed Daniel the page. It was a simple, handwritten letter of intent, notarized, dated 4 months earlier, stating that in the event any settlement or recovery came to him through the case, he wanted it directed in full to establish a scholarship fund at his old high school back in Marietta, the one Daniel had watched him graduate from, the one Ethan's mother had taught at for 9 years before she died, specifically for kids from single-parent households pursuing degrees in accounting, data analysis, or criminal justice. At the bottom, in the same careful handwriting, was a short note. "Dad, if you're ever reading this, it means something happened before I got to explain everything myself. I'm okay, whatever's going on when you read this, I promise I thought this through and I wasn't scared. I just wanted to make sure something good came out of all the late nights. You always told me the point of doing the right thing quietly is that you don't need anyone to know you did it. I believed you, I still do. Take care of yourself. I love you. E." Daniel read it twice, then a third time. His hands were shaking too badly to hold the page steady, and Rosalind, without a word, reached over and held the other end of it so he could keep reading. "He wrote this 4 months ago," Daniel finally managed. "He knew it might come to this." "I don't think he expected it," Rosalind said carefully. "I think he was being careful, the way careful people are. I don't believe for a second that he thought he was going to die in a car accident on a Tuesday in April. I think he was just the kind of person who prepared for things other people don't bother preparing for. It's the same instinct that made him find the fraud in the first place. He noticed things, he thought ahead." Daniel sat with the letter in his lap for a long time. Outside, the forklift had stopped moving. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang twice and went quiet. "Why didn't anyone tell me any of this before the funeral?" he finally asked, though there was no accusation left in his voice, only exhaustion. "Legal wanted to wait until the paperwork with the estate was further along, and honestly, I wasn't sure it was my place," Rosalind admitted. "But I stood at that funeral and listened to people talk about Ethan like he was just a quiet young man who kept to himself and did his job well, and I couldn't let that be the only story anyone ever told about him. He was quiet, he did keep to himself. But he was also the bravest person I've ever managed, and I thought his father, of all people, deserved to know that before too much time passed." Daniel nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he finally found his voice, it came out rough. He always was like that, even as a kid. He never wanted credit for anything. He'd fix things around the house and not even mention it. I'd just noticed days later that a fence board had been replaced or the gutter was cleared. His mother used to say he had a servant's heart. I thought she meant he was just helpful. I didn't understand she meant something bigger than that. "I think she meant exactly what happened here," Rosalind said gently. They sat together for a while after that, not saying much. Rosalind walked him through the rest of the file at his own pace, the emails, the depositions, a printed photo from a company holiday party 18 months earlier that Daniel had never seen, Ethan laughing at something off camera, more unguarded and easy than Daniel remembered him being in years. Grief, Daniel was learning, did not arrive all at once. It arrived in waves, and this, sitting in a strange break room 2 hours from home, learning that his private, quiet son had spent years quietly risking himself to do something right, and had planned, in the event of his own death, to turn whatever came of it into an act of generosity for kids he'd never meet. This was a wave unlike any of the others. It didn't knock him down the way the first days after the accident had. It filled something instead of hollowing it further. Before he left, Rosalind handed him a business card with the name of the estate attorney handling the case and told him someone would be in touch about the scholarship fund paperwork in the coming weeks, whenever he felt ready to deal with it. "There's no rush," she said. "Take whatever time you need." Daniel thanked her, shook her hand again, and walked back out to the gravel lot alone. He sat in his car for a long time before starting the engine, the manila folder resting on the passenger seat where Ethan used to sit on the rare drives they'd taken together, back before Columbus, back before all of this. He thought about the 6 p.m. phone calls, every Sunday without fail, for 4 years. He thought about how Ethan had never once, in any of those calls, let slip even a hint of the weight he was carrying, the late nights, the careful spreadsheets, the danger he'd quietly prepared for without ever alarming the one person who would have worried himself sick over it. He thought about the letter, folded now in his breast pocket, and the words "I wasn't scared," and wondered whether that was entirely true or whether it was one final, gentle lie his son had told him out of love, the same kind he'd been telling for years. Either way, Daniel decided, driving home as the Ohio farmland rolled past in the gathering dusk, he would make sure the scholarship happened. He would see to every detail of it himself, and he would make sure it carried Ethan's mother's name alongside his, the Whitfield family scholarship, because in the end, that was the truth Daniel had come to Columbus to find. Not a scandal, not a secret shame. Just a son who had turned out, quietly, and without asking for a single word of praise, to be exactly the kind of man his mother had always known he would become. He didn't cry until he was almost home, and when he finally did, somewhere on the dark stretch of highway outside Marietta, it didn't feel like the same grief he'd carried for 3 weeks. It felt, for the first time since the funeral, like something closer to pride.